You know what it feels like to have your entire life's work dismissed with a single word? To watch someone you trusted, someone you welcomed into your family, tear down everything you've built in front of the people you love most? That moment when the mask slips and you see who they really are underneath all the fake smiles and empty promises? Well, I'm 73 years old, and I thought I'd seen it all. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what my son-in-law did to me at that dinner table. What he said. What he thought he could get away with. But here's the thing about underestimating an old man who's been through hell and back. We don't just get mad. We get even. And we do it in ways that leave scars they'll carry for the rest of their miserable lives. If you've ever been humiliated by someone who thought they were better than you, if you've ever wanted to see justice served cold and calculated, then you need to hear this story. Because what I'm about to tell you will make you believe that sometimes, just sometimes, the universe has a twisted sense of justice. Hit that subscribe button if you want to see how this ends, because I promise you, the payback I delivered will haunt him forever. And if you've got family drama of your own, drop a comment below. Trust me, after what you're about to hear, you'll know you're not alone. My name is Frank Castellano, and this is the story of how I taught my son-in-law that respect isn't optional, it's earned. And when you lose it, you pay a price that money can't fix. Let me paint you a picture of my life before everything went sideways. For 47 years, I ran Castellano Construction. Started with nothing but a beat-up pickup truck, a toolbox my father left me, and more determination than sense. Built that company from the ground up, one job at a time, one satisfied customer after another. We did everything. Residential, commercial, renovations, new builds. By the time I was ready to step back, we had 12 full-time crews and a reputation that stretched across 3 counties. I wasn't just the owner. I was out there in the dirt, in the rain, in the blazing summer heat. I knew every nail, every board, every pipe that went into every job we did. My hands tell the story. Scarred, weathered, missing half a finger from a table saw incident in 1987. These hands built schools, churches, family homes where kids took their first steps and grandparents drew their last breaths. I was proud of that work. It meant something. My wife Maria used to joke that I loved concrete and lumber more than I loved her. She wasn't entirely wrong, but she understood. She knew that every foundation I poured, every roof I raised, was building something bigger than just a paycheck. It was building our future, our daughter's future, our legacy. Maria passed 6 years ago. Cancer. The aggressive kind that doesn't give you time to say goodbye properly. Those last months, watching her fade away in that hospital bed, it changed something in me. Made me realize that all the buildings in the world don't matter if you don't have someone to share them with. After the funeral, I started stepping back from the business. Handed more and more responsibility to my foreman Danny, who'd been with me for 23 years. That's when my daughter Angela started bringing around this new boyfriend, Derek Morrison. First time I met him, he showed up at my house wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people make in a month. Firm handshake, perfect teeth. Talked about his job and finance like he was explaining rocket science to a child. Everything about him screamed money, success, sophistication. Angela was smitten. My 34-year-old daughter, who'd been through 2 bad relationships and sworn off men entirely, was suddenly giggling like a teenager whenever this guy called. And I get it. After Maria died, Angela became my whole world. She'd been taking care of me, making sure I ate real meals instead of cereal for dinner, dragging me out of the house when I got too lost in my grief. She deserved happiness. She deserved someone who would love her the way her mother and I loved each other. Derek seemed to fit the bill. He was attentive, thoughtful, always showing up with flowers or surprise dinner reservations at fancy restaurants. Angela would tell me about these elaborate dates, wine tastings, Broadway shows, weekend trips to places I couldn't even pronounce. It was like watching her discover a whole new world. But there were little things, comments that didn't sit right with me. The way he'd look around my house. The house I'd built with my own hands for Maria and Angela 30 years ago. like he was calculating its property value. How he'd redirect conversations whenever I talked about construction work, like manual labor, was beneath discussion. The condescending smile when I'd mention fishing trips with my crew or poker nights with the guys from the union hall. Still, I kept my mouth shut. Angela was happy. That's all that mattered. The engagement happened fast. 6 months after they started dating, Derek proposed at some 5-star restaurant in the city. Angela called me that night, crying happy tears, talking a mile a minute about wedding plans and dress shopping. I listened and smiled and told her how thrilled I was because I was. If this was what she wanted, if this man made her happy, then I'd find a way to make it work. The wedding was everything Derek's family expected: elegant, expensive, perfect. 300 guests at a country club I'd driven past 1,000 times but never thought I'd see the inside of. Derek's father owned a chain of luxury car dealerships, and his mother came from old money, the kind of people who summered in Martha's Vineyard and talked about their ancestors coming over on the Mayflower. I felt out of place in my rented tux, surrounded by people who spoke in code about stock options and trust funds. But watching Angela walk down that aisle, seeing her face light up when she looked at Derek, it was worth every uncomfortable moment. She looked exactly like her mother on our wedding day, radiant, hopeful, ready to take on the world with the man she loved. The first year of their marriage seemed good. They bought a house in one of those new developments where every lawn looks like a golf course and the mailboxes all match. Angela would invite me over for dinner every few weeks, and Derek would make an effort to include me in conversation. We'd talk about sports, the weather, safe topics that didn't venture into territory where our different backgrounds might clash. But gradually, things started to shift. Derek began making comments about my retirement, always with air quotes, like the idea of a working man stepping back from his business was somehow quaint. He'd suggest that Angela and I spend less time together, that it wasn't healthy for a married woman to be so close to her father. When Angela would mention visiting me or helping me sort through Maria's belongings, Derek would get this look. Not angry, exactly, but impatient, like she was wasting time on something unimportant. The real problem started when Angela got pregnant. Suddenly, Derek had opinions about everything. The nursery should be painted gender-neutral colors because traditional pink and blue were limiting. They needed to research the best preschools immediately because waiting lists filled up fast in their neighborhood. Angela should quit her job as a teacher because their family needed to focus on maximizing potential. When Angela had a difficult first trimester and needed help, Derek was always too busy with work to drive her to doctor appointments. Guess who got those calls? Me. I'd drop everything to take my daughter to her checkups, hold her hair back when morning sickness hit, run to the grocery store at midnight because she was craving pickles and ice cream. Derek never said thank you. Not once. It was like he expected me to be available whenever they needed something, but heaven forbid I might have my own life, my own plans, my own opinions about how things should be done. The baby came early. Little Tommy. 5 weeks premature but healthy, thank God. I'll never forget holding him for the first time, seeing Maria's eyes in his tiny face, feeling that overwhelming rush of love and responsibility. This was my grandson, my legacy, the next generation of Castellanos. Derek barely let me near the kid. Oh, he was subtle about it. Always had reasons why visits needed to be shorter, why I couldn't babysit, why family gatherings should be kept small. He'd make comments about germs from the construction site, even though I'd been retired for 2 years by then. He'd suggest that an elderly man might not have the energy to keep up with a toddler. Every boundary he set felt like a knife twist, separating me from the family I'd worked my whole life to build and protect. Angela tried to balance it all, tried to keep everyone happy, but Derek was her husband, the father of her child. When it came down to choosing sides, she chose him. I understood it, even respected it, but it didn't hurt any less. Things came to a head last Christmas. Derek's parents had flown in from Boston, and Angela invited me over for Christmas dinner. I showed up with presents for everyone, including a hand-carved wooden toy chest I'd spent months making for Tommy, real craftsmanship, the kind of piece that gets passed down through generations. Derek took one look at it and frowned. He said it didn't match the nursery's aesthetic. Said they'd already bought Tommy a toy organizer from some designer children's store, something made of white plastic with clean lines and minimal design. My toy chest, with its hand-carved animals and rich walnut finish, looked outdated next to their modern furniture. I watched him move my gift to a corner of the garage like it was junk he'd deal with later. Angela tried to smooth things over, said they'd find the perfect spot for it. But I could see the embarrassment in her eyes. Not embarrassment about Derek's rudeness, but embarrassment about me. About the grandfather who didn't understand that love wasn't measured by the hours you spent with sandpaper and wood stain, but by the price tag at expensive stores. That should have been my wake-up call. Should have been the moment I realized that Derek Morrison didn't just disrespect me. He actively despised everything I represented. But I was still trying to keep the peace, still hoping we could find common ground for Angela's sake. The breaking point came 3 months later, at what Derek called a family meeting. He and Angela had been talking about moving. Derek had gotten a promotion that required relocating to Atlanta. Better opportunity, bigger salary, chance to advance his career. Angela was torn. She loved her teaching job, had friends and roots in our town, didn't want to take Tommy away from his grandfather. But Derek was pushing hard, painting pictures of private schools and country clubs and all the advantages their son would have in a bigger city. They invited me over to discuss it, which should have been my first clue that something was wrong. Derek never wanted my input on anything, but I showed up anyway, hoping maybe this was his way of extending an olive branch, including me in an important family decision. The meeting was at their house in Derek's home office. He sat behind his big mahogany desk like he was conducting a board meeting. Angela sat in one of the client chairs, looking nervous and uncomfortable. They'd left me the other chair, positioned slightly farther back, like I was observing rather than participating. Derek started with what he called the opportunity, explained his promotion, the salary increase, the career trajectory, used words like synergy and market positioning, like he was trying to impress me with his business vocabulary. I nodded along, waiting for him to get to the point. Then he shifted to what he called the challenges. Angela's job search, finding the right neighborhood, researching schools for Tommy. All solvable problems, he said, with proper planning and commitment. Angela would find a new teaching position, maybe even a better one. They'd make new friends, build a new life. Finally, he got to what he called the Frank situation. I remember those exact words because they hit me like a slap. Not including Frank in our decision, or making sure Frank stays connected to Tommy. The Frank situation. Like I was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be considered. Derek leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, and laid out his concerns. I was getting older, he said, living alone in a big house that was probably too much for me to maintain, isolated from social connections now that I'd retired, dependent on Angela for emotional support in ways that might not be healthy for any of us. The solution, according to Derek, was for me to sell my house and use the proceeds to buy a condo in a senior living community, somewhere with activities and medical support and people my own age. I'd be happier, he said, more fulfilled. And Angela would have the freedom to start fresh in Atlanta without worrying about leaving me behind. I sat there listening to this man plan out the rest of my life like he was organizing a business merger, watched him reduce everything I'd built, everything I was, to a logistical problem that needed solving. He never asked what I wanted, never considered that I might have my own thoughts about where I wanted to live or how I wanted to spend my remaining years. Angela looked uncomfortable, kept glancing between Derek and me like she was watching a tennis match. When Derek finished his presentation, he turned to her expectantly, waiting for her to back him up, to sell me on this vision of my golden years spent playing shuffleboard with strangers while my grandson grew up 800 miles away. I waited for her to say something, to stand up for me, to remind her husband that I was her father, not some burden to be disposed of. But she just sat there twisting her wedding ring, looking anywhere but at me. That's when I realized the truth. This wasn't a family meeting. It was an intervention. They'd already decided to move to Atlanta. They'd already decided I was too old, too much trouble, too embarrassing to include in their new life. This whole charade was just Derek's way of making it seem like I had a choice in the matter. I told them I needed time to think about it. Derek seemed satisfied, probably figured he'd presented such a compelling case that I'd come around to his way of thinking. Angela hugged me goodbye, but it felt different, distant, like she was already practicing for the years ahead when hugs would be reserved for holiday visits and special occasions. Driving home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about Maria, about all the times she'd warned me that people would try to put me out to pasture once I got old, treat me like I was used up and worthless just because my hair was gray and my back ached more than it used to. She'd made me promise to fight for my place in the world, to never let anyone decide my value based on my age instead of my character. I'd failed her, failed myself, failed the man I used to be, who would never have sat quietly while some arrogant kid dismissed 47 years of hard work and sacrifice as a situation to be managed. But it wasn't too late. Not yet. The first thing I did was call my lawyer, Jim Patterson. Jim and I had gone to high school together, played on the same football team before life took us in different directions. He'd handled all my business contracts over the years, helped me set up the trust for Angela, dealt with the legal paperwork when I started transitioning out of day-to-day operations at the company. Jim listened while I explained Derek's proposal, how they wanted me to sell the house and move into some retirement community so Angela could start fresh in Atlanta. When I finished, there was silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Jim said something that changed everything. "Frank, do you remember what you put in Angela's trust?" I'd set up the trust 15 years ago, when business was booming and I wanted to make sure Angela would be financially secure no matter what happened to me. Put a significant chunk of my assets in there, not just cash but ownership stakes in some of the commercial properties Castellano Construction had developed over the years. Jim had structured it so Angela would receive income from those properties for the rest of her life, with full control of the principal when she turned 40. "The thing is," Jim continued, "Derek doesn't know about the trust. Angela never told him the full extent of what she's inheriting. He thinks her financial security comes from whatever you might leave her in your will." That's when the pieces started falling into place. Derek wasn't just trying to get rid of me. He was trying to get his hands on what he thought was Angela's inheritance. If I sold the house and moved into assisted living, there'd be less money left when I died. But if I were to die unexpectedly, before making any major financial changes. "Jim," I said, "what would happen if I updated my will? Made some changes to how my estate gets distributed?" "Well, that's entirely your prerogative, Frank. But if you're thinking what I think you're thinking, we should be very careful about how we proceed." We met the next day. Jim's office hadn't changed much over the years. Same wood paneling, same leather chairs, same smell of old books and coffee that always reminded me of important decisions being made. We spent 3 hours going through my finances, my assets, my current estate plan. What we discovered was eye-opening. Between the house, my remaining stake in Castellano Construction, some smart investments I'd made over the years, and a life insurance policy I'd carried for decades, I was worth significantly more than Derek realized. More than Angela realized, truth be told. I'd always been private about money, figured it was better for people to underestimate rather than overestimate what I had. Jim explained my options. I could restructure everything, set up new trusts, create conditions for inheritance that would make Derek's life very complicated. Or I could do something more immediate, more direct. "There's another option," Jim said, leaning back in his chair with a slight smile. "Something that might help you see Derek's true colors before Angela makes the biggest mistake of her life." He explained his idea. It was devious, elegant, and perfectly legal. More importantly, it would give Derek exactly what he thought he wanted, in a way that would expose him for the greedy, manipulative person he really was. We spent the next week setting everything up. Jim handled the legal paperwork while I made some phone calls, had some conversations with people I'd known for decades in the construction industry. By the time we were finished, I had everything I needed to give Derek Morrison a lesson in respect he'd never forget. The plan was simple. I was going to die. Not literally, of course. But as far as Derek was concerned, Frank Castellano was going to become a very sick old man whose time was running out fast. And when people think you're dying, they stop pretending to be nice. They show you who they really are. It started with a call to Angela. I told her I'd been having some chest pains. Nothing serious. But my doctor wanted me to come in for some tests. Could she drive me to the appointment? I hated to ask, especially with Derek's promotion and the move to Atlanta to think about. But I didn't like driving myself when I was feeling dizzy. Angela dropped everything, of course. Picked me up the next morning and sat with me in Dr. Morgan's waiting room, holding my hand like I was already on my deathbed. Dr. Morgan, who'd been treating me for 20 years and was in on the plan, delivered the news with just the right amount of professional concern. My heart wasn't in good shape. The tests showed some blockages, irregular rhythms, signs of significant deterioration. We'd need to do more tests, but he was recommending immediate lifestyle changes and possibly surgery. At my age, with my medical history, it was going to be touch and go. Angela was devastated, started crying right there in the doctor's office, asking about treatment options and second opinions and how long I might have. Dr. Morgan was appropriately vague. Could be months, could be years, impossible to say without more information. I played my part perfectly, acted scared but trying to be brave for Angela's sake. Talked about how I didn't want to be a burden, how maybe Derek was right about me moving into a place with medical support nearby. Maybe the Atlanta move should go forward as planned. Angela shouldn't put her life on hold because her old man was falling apart. Derek's reaction when Angela told him was everything I'd hoped for and more. He immediately started talking about silver linings, how this actually simplified their decision-making process, how it wouldn't make sense for me to fight the inevitable by clinging to a house that was too big for me anyway, how they could help me find a nice facility in Atlanta, somewhere close to their new home, where I could spend my remaining time near my family. But then came the conversation I'd been waiting for, the one that revealed Derek Morrison's true priorities. Angela was at work, and Derek stopped by my house unannounced, said he wanted to talk man-to-man about practical matters, how I wanted to handle my affairs, what kind of arrangements I was thinking about making. We sat in my living room, the same room where I'd taught Angela to ride a bicycle, where Maria and I had danced to our wedding song on our 20th anniversary, where 3 generations of Castellanos had celebrated birthdays and holidays, and all the moments that make a life worth living. Derek sat forward in his chair, hands clasped, wearing what he probably thought was a compassionate expression. He started with the usual bullshit, how sorry he was about my diagnosis, how he wanted me to know that he'd always thought of me as family, how he hoped we could set aside any past misunderstandings in light of the circumstances. Then he got to the real reason for his visit. He'd been thinking about my situation, he said, about the stress I must be feeling, worrying about medical bills and end-of-life care and what would happen to my assets. He wanted me to know that I didn't have to face these concerns alone. He and Angela were prepared to help in any way they could, including, if I was interested, helping me manage my financial affairs during this difficult time. Derek had done his homework. He'd researched power of attorney agreements, estate planning, the legal mechanisms for transferring financial responsibility from an aging parent to their adult children. He presented it all as a generous offer, a way to lift the burden of money management from my shoulders so I could focus on my health. What he was really asking for was control of my assets while I was still alive. I let him talk, listened to him explain how much simpler everything would be if he and Angela could handle my finances, make decisions about selling the house, manage any investments. He had experience with this kind of thing, he said, professional training. I could trust him to make sure everything was handled properly, that my wishes were respected, that Angela's future was secure. The arrogance was breathtaking. This man had spent 2 years treating me like an embarrassing relic, dismissing my opinions, trying to push me out of my daughter's life. Now that he thought I was dying, suddenly he wanted to be my financial advisor and estate manager. I told him I appreciated the offer, that I'd need some time to think it over. Derek seemed satisfied, probably figured he'd planted the seed and now just needed to let it grow. He left that day with a spring in his step, no doubt already calculating how much money he'd have access to once I signed those papers. But I wasn't done with Derek Morrison. Not by a long shot. The next phase of my plan required some help from my old crew. Danny, who'd been running Castellano Construction since I stepped back, was more than happy to assist. So were Mike, Tommy, and Carlos. Guys who'd worked with me for decades, who understood what loyalty meant, who'd seen firsthand how Derek treated me at family gatherings. We started small. A few chance encounters around town where Derek would overhear conversations about my financial situation. Danny mentioning at the hardware store that Frank Castellano was probably worth more than people realized, what with all those commercial properties and investments. Mike talking at the diner about how construction guys like me were always smarter with money than people gave us credit for. Carlos wondering aloud at the gas station whether Frank had ever done anything about updating his will after Maria died. Word travels fast in a small town, especially when it's about money. Within 2 weeks, Derek was asking Angela subtle questions about my assets, my business relationships, my long-term financial planning. He'd even driven past some of the commercial properties that carried Castellano Construction signs, probably trying to estimate their value. The hook was set. Now I just needed to reel him in. I called Derek and asked if he could meet me at my lawyer's office. Said I'd been thinking about his offer to help with my financial affairs, and I was ready to move forward with some changes to my estate planning. Could he and Angela both be there? I wanted to make sure everything was handled as a family. Derek agreed immediately. Too immediately. Like he'd been waiting for that call, planning for it, rehearsing what he'd say when the moment arrived. The meeting was scheduled for a Friday afternoon. Jim Patterson's office, same wood paneling and leather chairs where we'd hatched this plan weeks earlier. I arrived first, of course. Wanted to make sure everything was set up perfectly. Angela and Derek showed up together, Derek wearing his most expensive suit and carrying a leather portfolio like he was attending a board meeting. Angela looked nervous, kept asking if I was sure about this, if I wasn't rushing into decisions while I was still processing the diagnosis. Jim welcomed everyone, offered coffee, made the usual small talk about weather and local news. Then he opened the folder containing the papers I'd asked him to prepare. The first document was a new will. Jim explained the contents in his formal lawyer voice, how I was updating my previous estate plan to reflect my current circumstances and wishes. The house would go to Angela, as expected. My remaining stake in Castellano Construction would be liquidated, with proceeds split between Angela and a college fund for Tommy. Derek was taking notes, nodding along, probably calculating numbers in his head. Then Jim got to the interesting part. I'd decided to establish a new trust, funded by my liquid assets and the proceeds from selling several investment properties. The trust would provide income for Angela and Tommy, managed by a trustee with financial expertise and a proven track record of responsible money management. Derek looked up from his notepad, suddenly paying very close attention. The trustee, Jim continued, would have broad discretionary powers over the trust assets, investment decisions, distribution schedules, even the ability to modify terms based on changing family circumstances. It was a significant responsibility, one that required absolute trust and confidence in the person selected for the role. Derek was practically vibrating with excitement. This was it, the moment he'd been waiting for. The chance to control not just my money, but Angela's financial future and Tommy's inheritance. He probably thought he'd hit the lottery. That's when Jim delivered the punchline. After careful consideration, I'd selected the most qualified person I knew to serve as trustee. Someone with decades of experience managing complex financial situations. Someone who understood the importance of family legacy and long-term planning. Someone I trusted completely to protect the interests of my daughter and grandson. The trustee would be Daniel Patrick O'Sullivan, my foreman Danny, who'd been running Castellano Construction's finances for 15 years and had never made a decision that wasn't in the best interest of working families. The color drained from Derek's face. Danny O'Sullivan, the guy who wore work boots to family barbecues and called Derek college boy when he thought no one was listening, was about to become the gatekeeper to Angela's inheritance. But I wasn't finished yet. The trust came with conditions, specific requirements that had to be met for Angela to receive her full inheritance. She needed to remain married to Derek for at least 10 years from the date of my death. She needed to stay within 100 miles of my hometown, to maintain connections to the community where she'd grown up. And she needed to raise Tommy with an understanding of his grandfather's values: hard work, family loyalty, respect for people regardless of their economic status. If any of these conditions were violated, the trust would be dissolved and the assets donated to charity. Derek was staring at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. His grand plan to gain control of my money had just turned into a straightforward inheritance with strings attached, strings that would keep Angela tied to everything he wanted her to leave behind. Jim asked if there were any questions about the trust structure. Derek cleared his throat, tried to sound casual as he inquired about the trustee selection process. Surely there were other candidates who might be better qualified. Someone with formal financial training, perhaps? I looked Derek straight in the eye and told him that Danny O'Sullivan was the most honest, trustworthy man I'd ever known. That I'd watched him handle money responsibly for 15 years, never taking so much as an extra dime that didn't belong to him. That if I couldn't trust Danny with my family's future, there wasn't anyone in the world I could trust. Angela seemed relieved, actually. She'd always liked Danny, appreciated how he'd looked out for me after Maria died. The idea of having someone familiar managing her inheritance probably felt comforting compared to dealing with lawyers and financial advisors she didn't know. Derek signed the papers because he had to, because refusing would have exposed his true motives, revealed that his concern for my financial well-being was really about his access to my assets. But I could see the rage building behind his fake smile, the frustration of a man who'd been outmaneuvered by someone he'd consistently underestimated. We left the lawyer's office that day with everything legally binding and properly notarized. Derek was quiet on the drive home, probably trying to figure out how to salvage his plans. Angela was emotional, but grateful, thanking me for thinking about her future, even while dealing with my own health problems. I went home and opened a bottle of bourbon, the good stuff Maria used to save for special occasions. Because phase 1 of my plan was complete, and Derek Morrison had just gotten his first taste of what it felt like to be disappointed by someone you'd trusted to give you what you wanted. But the real show was just getting started. Over the next few weeks, I continued playing the role of the dying man, coming to terms with his mortality. Had a few more medical appointments that Angela would drive me to, came home with pill bottles and restrictions on my activities. Started talking about bucket list items, things I wanted to do while I still had time. Derek was supportive on the surface, but I could see him getting more agitated as the reality of my trust arrangement sank in. He'd call Angela at work, push her to ask me about other assets I might not have mentioned, suggest that maybe we should get a second opinion on the trustee selection, consult with a more experienced financial advisor. Angela would relay these conversations to me, usually with an apologetic tone, like she was embarrassed by her husband's persistence but felt obligated to pass along his concerns. Each time I'd reiterate my confidence in Danny, my satisfaction with the arrangements I'd made. The breaking point came when Derek suggested we all have dinner together to celebrate my estate planning decisions. Said he wanted to take us somewhere nice, his treat, a chance for the family to come together during this difficult time. He chose the most expensive restaurant in town, Chez Laurent, a French place that had opened a few years back in the renovated historic district. The kind of establishment where appetizers cost more than most people spend on lunch, where the wine list reads like a European geography lesson. Derek made reservations for 7 o'clock on a Saturday night, prime time for showing off. I should have known something was up when he insisted on driving, picking up Angela and me instead of meeting at the restaurant. Should have recognized the setup when he specifically requested a table in the main dining room, where everyone could see us. But I was too focused on my own plans to pay attention to his. We arrived at Chez Laurent fashionably on time. Derek had dressed for the occasion, expensive suit, Italian leather shoes, watch that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. He'd clearly told Angela to dress up too, because she was wearing a black cocktail dress I'd never seen before. Her hair done in some elaborate style that must have taken hours at the salon. I felt underdressed in my khakis and sport coat, but I was supposed to be a sick old man who didn't have the energy to worry about fashion. Derek seemed pleased by the contrast, probably thought it reinforced the narrative he was building about our different social positions. The maitre d' led us to a prominent table near the center of the dining room, exactly where Derek could make sure everyone saw him dining with his elderly father-in-law and beautiful wife. The restaurant was busy, filled with the kind of clientele Derek aspired to join. Business executives, doctors, lawyers, people who measured their worth by their ability to afford overpriced food and pretentious service. Derek ordered wine without consulting us, some French vintage that the sommelier praised like it was liquid poetry. He made a show of tasting it, swirling and sniffing and nodding approvingly, before giving his consent to pour for the table. The whole performance was designed to demonstrate his sophistication, his belonging in this world of refined tastes and expensive pleasures. I ordered the simplest thing on the menu, grilled chicken with vegetables, while Derek went for the lobster thermidor, and Angela chose some complicated fish dish with a sauce I couldn't pronounce. Derek kept the wine flowing, talking about his promotion, their plans for Atlanta, the wonderful opportunities Tommy would have growing up in a more cosmopolitan environment. Through the first course, everything was pleasant enough. Derek was charming, attentive to Angela, respectful to me in that practiced way people use when they're performing for an audience. He asked about my health, my comfort level with the restaurant, whether I needed anything to make the evening more enjoyable. But I could see the tension building in his shoulders, the way his smile became more forced as the night progressed. He was working up to something, gathering courage or maybe just waiting for enough alcohol to loosen his tongue. It happened during the main course. Derek started talking about legacy, about the responsibilities that come with financial success, about the importance of making smart decisions when it comes to family money. He praised my business acumen, my years of hard work, the foundation I'd built for Angela's future. Then he pivoted to concern, gentle, caring concern about my ability to make sound financial decisions while dealing with a serious medical diagnosis. He'd been reading about how stress and medication can affect cognitive function in older adults, how people in my situation sometimes made emotional choices that weren't necessarily the most rational from a long-term planning perspective. Angela was looking uncomfortable, probably sensing where this was heading. She tried to change the subject, asked Derek about his new responsibilities at work, but he wasn't ready to let go. He wanted me to know, Derek continued, that he'd been researching the trust arrangement I'd established, talking to some colleagues in the financial services industry, getting opinions about the structure I'd chosen. And frankly, he was concerned that I might not have explored all my options, the trustee selection, for instance. While he was sure Danny O'Sullivan was a fine person, Derek had questions about his qualifications to manage a substantial estate. Did Danny have formal training in investment management, experience with tax planning, knowledge of current financial regulations? Derek had taken the liberty of consulting with his own financial advisor, a certified wealth management professional with decades of experience serving high-net-worth clients. This advisor had reviewed the trust documents and identified several areas where a more experienced trustee could potentially improve outcomes for Angela and Tommy. I set down my fork and looked at Derek across the table. The restaurant noise seemed to fade into background buzz as I realized what was happening. This dinner wasn't a celebration, it was an ambush. Derek had brought me to this expensive restaurant, in front of all these witnesses, to pressure me into changing my estate plans while I was supposedly dying and vulnerable. The audacity was breathtaking. But I let him continue. Derek pulled out his phone, started showing me charts and projections his financial advisor had prepared. Different investment strategies, diversification options, tax optimization techniques that could potentially increase the trust's value by significant percentages over time. All delivered with the kind of smooth professional confidence that had probably convinced a lot of people to hand over their money over the years. Angela was mortified. She kept trying to stop him, saying this wasn't the time or place for business discussions, that I was supposed to be relaxing and enjoying dinner. But Derek was committed now, had crossed the line from subtle manipulation to direct pressure. He leaned forward, lowered his voice to that confidential tone people use when they're about to share important secrets. He understood my loyalty to Danny, he said, appreciated the personal relationship, the years of trust and friendship. But this wasn't about personal feelings. This was about Angela's future, Tommy's inheritance, the responsibility we both had to make sure my life's work provided maximum benefit for the people I loved most. Wouldn't I want to know that I'd done everything possible to secure their financial well-being? Wouldn't I sleep better knowing that professionals with proven track records were managing assets that represented decades of my hard work and sacrifice? That's when Derek made his fatal mistake. He suggested that maybe my attachment to Danny as trustee wasn't really about financial management at all. Maybe it was about something else. Maybe, in my current emotional state, dealing with mortality and medical problems, I was making decisions based on sentiment rather than logic. Maybe I was letting my blue-collar background cloud my judgment about what was best for my family's future. The words hung in the air between us like smoke from a gun. Derek seemed to realize he'd gone too far, but he couldn't take it back. Angela was staring at him with shock and growing anger. Other diners were starting to notice our table, drawn by the tension that was suddenly crackling around us like electricity. I took a sip of wine, set the glass down carefully, and looked Derek Morrison straight in the eye. "Are you saying I'm incompetent?" Derek tried to backtrack immediately, said that wasn't what he meant at all, that he had tremendous respect for my intelligence and business experience. He was just trying to make sure I had all the information I needed to make the best possible decisions, but I wasn't going to let him wiggle out of it that easily. "Because it sounds like you're saying that a man who built a successful construction company from nothing, who provided for his family for 47 years, who accumulated enough wealth to make you this interested in managing it, is too stupid to choose his own trustee." The restaurant had gone quiet around our table. Not completely silent, but quiet enough that nearby diners were definitely listening to our conversation. Derek was sweating now, realizing that his carefully planned intervention was turning into a public spectacle. Angela tried to mediate, suggested we table the discussion until we could talk privately at home. But I wasn't finished with Derek Morrison. Not by a long shot. I asked him to explain exactly what qualifications he thought Danny O'Sullivan was lacking. Danny had managed Castellano Construction's finances for 15 years without losing a penny, had overseen payroll for dozens of employees, handled tax filings, managed equipment purchases and project budgets worth millions of dollars. Had never made a financial decision that put personal gain ahead of the company's welfare or the workers' security. What specific expertise did Derek's financial advisor possess that Danny lacked? Derek fumbled through an answer about market analysis and portfolio diversification, industry certifications, and regulatory compliance. All the buzzwords he'd learned in business school, delivered with decreasing confidence as he realized how shallow they sounded compared to 15 years of real-world experience. I nodded along, pretending to consider his points. Then I asked the question that cut to the heart of his real motivation. "And what would be your role in all this, Derek? If I changed trustees, how exactly would you fit into the new arrangement?" Derek's face flushed red. He stammered something about wanting to stay involved, to make sure Angela's interests were protected, to provide oversight and guidance based on his financial background. "So you want to manage my daughter's inheritance yourself?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered loudly enough for half the restaurant to hear. Derek tried to deny it, said that wasn't what he was suggesting at all. But his body language betrayed him. The defensive posture, the nervous fidgeting, the way he couldn't meet my eyes. Angela was looking at her husband like she was seeing him clearly for the first time. The pieces were falling into place in her mind. Derek's sudden interest in my financial affairs, his pressure to move to Atlanta, his eagerness to help manage my estate planning, all of it connected to his desire to control money that didn't belong to him. I stood up from the table, slowly, like the sick old man I was supposed to be, reached into my wallet and pulled out my credit card, placed it next to my barely touched dinner. "Derek," I said, loud enough for everyone in the restaurant to hear, "you've made your position very clear. You think I'm incompetent. Too old, too stupid, too sentimental to make intelligent decisions about my own money. Derek was frantically trying to shush me, looking around at the other diners who were now openly staring at our table, but I wasn't done. You think that because you wear expensive suits and use big words, you're entitled to manage assets I spent my entire life accumulating. You think that your MBA makes you smarter than a man who built something real with his own hands. I picked up my credit card and put it back in my wallet. Well, Derek, let me give you a lesson in competence. You wanted to demonstrate your sophistication by bringing us to this fancy restaurant. You wanted to show everyone how successful and important you are. You ordered the most expensive wine, the most elaborate dishes, made sure everyone could see you living the high life. Derek was pale now, probably starting to realize what was coming. So here's your chance to prove how competent you really are. The bill for this dinner is yours. All of it. The wine, the food, the tip, everything. Consider it a small demonstration of your ability to handle financial responsibilities. I turned to Angela, who was sitting frozen in her chair, watching this confrontation unfold with a mixture of horror and fascination. Sweetheart, I love you more than life itself. But I will not sit here and be insulted by a man who thinks he can pressure me into changing my plans just because he's married to my daughter. If Derek believes he's qualified to manage hundreds of thousands of dollars in trust assets, he can start by proving he can handle a restaurant bill. Angela stood up, grabbed her purse, and came around the table to take my arm. She didn't say anything to Derek, didn't try to apologize or smooth things over. Just walked out of that restaurant with me while Derek sat at the table, staring at a check for $437 that he was going to have to pay whether he could afford it or not. We drove home in silence, Angela's hands shaking on the steering wheel. I could see her processing everything that had happened, all the implications and revelations and uncomfortable truths that had been exposed under those expensive restaurant lights. When we got to my house, she finally spoke. Dad, I'm so sorry. I had no idea Derek was going to do that. I thought it was just going to be a nice dinner. I patted her hand, told her it wasn't her fault, that Derek had shown his true colors tonight, and sometimes that's a painful but necessary thing to see. Is that really what he thinks of you? She asked. That you're incompetent? I looked at my daughter, this woman I'd raised to be strong and independent and capable of standing up for herself and the people she loved. Saw Maria's strength in her eyes, along with a growing understanding of what her husband had been trying to accomplish. Sweetheart, what Derek thinks of me doesn't matter. What matters is what you think, what you decide to do with this information. Angela cried that night, called me twice from her house, told me about the fight she and Derek had when he finally came home from the restaurant. How he tried to justify what he'd done, claim he was just looking out for her financial interests. How he couldn't understand why I was being so stubborn about accepting professional help. The fight escalated when Angela asked him directly if he'd been planning to manage her inheritance himself. Derek had apparently exploded, accused her of taking my side against her own husband, said she was being manipulated by an old man who couldn't accept that times had changed. That's when Angela learned something important about the man she'd married. Derek had debts, significant debts, credit card balances, student loans, money he'd borrowed to maintain the lifestyle that was so important to his professional image. The promotion to Atlanta came with a salary increase, but it also came with pressure to live in the right neighborhood, send Tommy to the right schools, maintain appearances that would help Derek advance his career. Angela's inheritance wasn't just attractive to Derek, it was necessary. He'd been counting on that money to solve his financial problems, to give him the freedom to take risks in his career without worrying about making ends meet. When Angela confronted him about this, Derek's mask finally came off completely. He told her she was naive if she thought love was more important than financial security, said she'd been sheltered by her father's money her whole life, didn't understand what it was like to face real financial pressure. He called me an old fool who was too sentimental to make rational decisions, said the trust arrangement I'd set up was a joke, that Danny O'Sullivan was a working-class moron who would probably lose Angela's inheritance through incompetent management. Angela hung up on me that second time, but not before I heard Derek in the background still ranting about how ungrateful we both were, how he was just trying to help, how nobody appreciated his expertise or his sacrifice. I went to bed that night, knowing I'd accomplished what I set out to do. Derek Morrison had revealed his true character, shown Angela exactly what kind of man she'd married. The question now was whether she'd have the courage to do something about it. The answer came 3 days later. Angela showed up at my house on a Wednesday morning, Tommy in her arms and 2 suitcases in the car. She'd left Derek. Told him she needed time to think, to figure out what she wanted to do about their marriage. He'd tried to stop her, threatened to fight for custody of Tommy, said she was making the biggest mistake of her life. But Angela had found something in herself that night at the restaurant. Some core of strength that reminded her who she was before Derek Morrison came along and tried to remake her in his image. We spent the day talking. Really talking. Maybe for the first time since she'd gotten married. Angela told me about all the little ways Derek had been trying to control her, isolate her from her friends and family, make her dependent on his approval and his vision of their future. The move to Atlanta wasn't about his career advancement. It was about separating her from everyone who knew her as Frank Castellano's daughter instead of Derek Morrison's wife. The pressure to quit her teaching job wasn't about focusing on Tommy's needs. It was about making sure Angela didn't have independent income or professional identity. Even Derek's objection to the toy chest I'd made for Tommy wasn't really about aesthetics. It was about erasing my presence from their home, making sure Tommy grew up thinking of Derek as the primary male influence in his life. "Dad," Angela said, bouncing Tommy on her knee while he played with wooden blocks I'd carved for him, "I think I've been living someone else's life for the past 2 years. I told her she could stay with me as long as she needed, that we'd figure out the legal aspects, make sure Tommy was protected, help her find her footing as a single mother if that's what she decided to do." Derek called 17 times that first day, left voicemails that ranged from apologetic to angry to desperate. Showed up at my house twice demanding to see his wife and son. I told him they weren't ready to talk, that he needed to give them space to process everything that had happened. On his second visit, Derek made the mistake of trying to push past me into my house. I may have been 73 years old, but I was still 6'2" and built like someone who'd spent 5 decades swinging hammers and carrying lumber. Derek bounced off me like he'd walked into a wall. That's when he made his second fatal mistake of the week. Standing on my front porch, frustrated and embarrassed and desperate, Derek Morrison told me exactly what he thought of me. Called me a bitter old man who couldn't stand to see his daughter happy. Said I was jealous of his success, resentful that Angela had found someone better than her working-class background. He accused me of faking my illness to manipulate Angela's emotions. Said I was probably lying about my assets too, just trying to make myself seem more important than I really was. Then he said the words I'd been waiting to hear for 2 years. "You're nothing but an incompetent old fool who's too stupid to realize when you're being helped." I smiled at Derek Morrison, the same smile I'd been practicing since the day we hatched this plan in Jim Patterson's office. "Derek," I said, "you might want to be careful throwing around words like incompetent, especially when you're talking to someone who's been recording every conversation we've had for the past 3 months. The color drained from Derek's face as I pulled out my phone, showed him the voice recording app that had been running during his entire rant. Every word he'd said, every insult and accusation and threat, captured in digital clarity. "You see, Derek, the thing about being an incompetent old fool is that sometimes you're smart enough to protect yourself, and smart enough to make sure your daughter knows exactly what kind of man she married." Derek tried to grab the phone, but I was already backing into my house, already closing the door between us. He pounded on the wood for a few minutes, shouting threats and demands, but eventually he gave up and drove away. That recording became very important during the divorce proceedings. Angela filed for separation the following week, citing irreconcilable differences and emotional abuse. Derek fought it initially, hired an expensive lawyer, tried to paint Angela as an unstable woman being manipulated by her controlling father. But then Jim Patterson shared some interesting information with Derek's attorney. Information about the trust fund Angela had been receiving income from for years, the one Derek didn't know existed. Information about my actual net worth, which was significantly higher than Derek had calculated. Information about the recordings I'd made of Derek's various schemes to gain control of my assets. Most importantly, information about my medical condition. Because here's the thing Derek never figured out. I wasn't dying. Wasn't even sick. Dr. Morgan and I had been friends for 20 years. He'd treated Maria during her illness, been the one to tell me there was nothing more the doctors could do for her. When I explained what Derek was trying to do, how he was manipulating my supposed mortality to pressure me into changing my estate plans, Dr. Morgan was more than happy to help. All those test results, all those grave conversations about my heart condition and prognosis, completely fabricated. Dr. Morgan had been very careful to make sure no actual medical records were falsified, no insurance fraud committed. But Derek had never asked to see the real test results, never questioned the doctor's authority, or requested second opinions. He'd just assumed that an old construction worker wouldn't be smart enough to orchestrate an elaborate deception. When Derek's lawyer learned the truth, the fight went out of his client pretty quickly. Hard to claim you were acting in someone's best interests when they weren't actually dying and had been mentally competent enough to run a months-long con that exposed your greed and manipulation. Derek agreed to an uncontested divorce. Angela got primary custody of Tommy, child support, and a settlement that gave her enough money to buy a house and start over. Derek got to keep his debts and his reputation as the man who tried to steal from his dying father-in-law. The whole process took 8 months. During that time, Angela and Tommy lived with me in the house I'd built for Maria. It was the best 8 months I'd had since my wife died. Watching my grandson take his first steps in the same living room where his mother had learned to walk, teaching him to use wooden tools just like I'd taught Angela. Seeing 3 generations of Castellanos under one roof again. Angela eventually bought a house 6 blocks away, close enough that Tommy could walk to Grandpa's house when he got older, far enough that she could build her own life and independence. She went back to teaching, found a job at the elementary school where she felt valued and respected. Derek moved to Atlanta alone, got the promotion he'd wanted so badly, found an apartment in one of those trendy downtown high-rises he'd always talked about. From what I heard through mutual acquaintances, he was dating again within 6 months, probably looking for another woman whose family assets he could manage. As for me, I had one last surprise for everyone who thought they knew Frank Castellano. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I called a family meeting. Angela, Danny, Jim Patterson, and a few of my oldest friends from the construction days. Told them I had an announcement to make about my health and my future plans. I was in perfect health. Always had been. The whole dying old man routine had been an act designed to expose Derek's true character and protect my daughter from a marriage that would have made her miserable. But more than that, I decided it was time to stop pretending to be retired. During those months of playing sick and helpless, I'd realized something important. I wasn't ready to be put out to pasture. Wasn't ready to spend my remaining years playing shuffleboard and complaining about young people. I had energy, experience, knowledge that was still valuable. So I was coming back to Castellano Construction. Not as the day-to-day manager, Danny had earned that position and deserved to keep it, but as the owner and founder, the guy with 47 years of relationships and reputation and hard-won wisdom. We were going to expand, take on bigger projects, maybe even some commercial development, train a new generation of craftsmen who understood that building something with your hands was just as valuable as managing someone else's money. Angela was laughing and crying at the same time, probably relieved that her father wasn't actually dying, definitely amazed at the elaborate scheme I'd pulled off. Danny was grinning like a fool, already talking about projects we could tackle, clients we could call. Jim Patterson just shook his head and said he should have known better than to believe Frank Castellano would go quietly into retirement. That was 2 years ago. Today I'm 75 years old and busier than I've been since Maria was alive. Castellano Construction is thriving. Tommy calls me every day after school to tell me about his adventures, and Angela has started dating a high school principal who thinks it's impressive that her father built half the buildings in town. Derek still lives in Atlanta, still working his way up the corporate ladder, still looking for shortcuts to wealth and success. Every now and then I hear through the grapevine that he's told someone about his crazy ex-father-in-law, The construction worker who faked a terminal illness just to make Derek look bad. People usually don't believe him. Because who would do something that elaborate, that calculated, that perfectly executed? Only someone who's been underestimated his whole life. Someone who knows that respect isn't about the size of your paycheck or the school where you got your degree. Someone who understands that the best revenge isn't getting mad. It's proving that you were never as helpless as they thought you were. Derek Morrison spent 2 years trying to convince everyone that Frank Castellano was incompetent. In the end, he proved exactly the opposite. And that restaurant bill? The one I left him with that night at Chez Laurent? Derek paid it, of course. Had to. But here's something he never found out. I owned the building where Chez Laurent was located. Had bought it as an investment property 15 years earlier, when the historic district was just getting started. So in a way, Derek Morrison did pay me back for all the disrespect and manipulation and attempts to steal from my family. He just did it $437 at a time, plus tip. That's the thing about underestimating people. Sometimes the person you think is weak and stupid and past their prime is actually 3 steps ahead of you, playing a game you didn't even know had started. Derek learned that lesson the hard way. Cost him a wife, a son, and a fortune he never actually had access to. But he learned it. And sometimes that's the best revenge of all, not destroying someone, but teaching them the truth about themselves, making them face the consequences of their own greed and arrogance and cruelty. Derek Morrison called me incompetent. Turns out I was competent enough to orchestrate his downfall without him ever realizing it was happening. Now he gets to live with that knowledge for the rest of his life. Every time he looks in the mirror, every time he tries to manipulate someone new, every time he thinks he's the smartest person in the room, he'll remember the old construction worker who outplayed him at his own game. That's a bill that never stops coming due, and unlike that dinner at Chez Laurent, Derek Morrison will be paying it forever. If this story taught you anything about standing up to people who try to tear you down, about the power of patience and planning when it comes to getting justice, then hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of revenge served cold. Drop a comment below if you've ever had someone underestimate you because of your age, your background, or your station in life. Because sometimes the best way to prove your worth is to let them dig their own grave while you hand them the shovel. Remember, respect isn't given based on what you have. It's earned by who you are and what you do with the power you possess. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is show someone exactly how wrong they were about you. Thanks for listening to my story. And remember, never underestimate an old man who's been through hell and lived to tell about it.